Well, welcome back to another video. I just wanted to introduce everyone properly to my new daily driver here. As some of you may have seen in a recent video I did at Donington, I went on a track day in this car. So check it out if you haven't already. I bought an EVO X, specifically a 2011 FQ360 GSR. You may have seen in previous videos my black EP3 Honda Civic Type R. That is no longer. I've sold that and got this instead. I was looking at EVOs for quite a while. I wanted one for the past, I've wanted one since Gran Turismo days, but that's pretty much the running theme of all of my car collection, as you may be able to tell with the Supra. I specifically went for an EVO because it just fits me in my current circumstances, and I'll go into that a little bit later on. Other options of cars that I was looking for would be Audi RS4 Estate. I was really keen on one of those. A little bit higher running costs, I'd say, potentially, if anything went wrong, but another lovely looking car. So the purpose of today's video is to just sort of run through the car itself, explain why I picked this particular one, and what it's like as a daily driver, as well as sort of pros and cons of the car itself. So a little bit more on the spec. This car itself is an FQ360 model. It's a manual. All of the FQ360s are manual because the SST gearbox, the sort of paddle shift gearbox that they made, was never really strong enough to go above the 330 models. As far as I'm aware, there's a 300, a 330, 360, 400 and a 440 model. The 400 and the 440s were sort of a special order one, I think. The 360s are sort of the achievable one to get that are not astronomical in value, although they are quite expensive. I've had it for about 3 months now, actually. It's just taken me this long to do a video on it. I do apologise, I've not been very good at keeping up to date on videos, but I will be doing better on this in the future, I promise. So I first started looking a couple of years ago at EVOs, EVO 10s in particular. I've always really fancied an EVO 5. They're my favourite shape, and you know, they're kind of the Gran Turismo shape that I remember getting on that game. But unfortunately for my job, I need to drive into London quite a lot, and that has a ULEZ zone, a ultra low emission zone, of which none of the previous shape EVOs other than the EVO 10 are compliant. So that would have just been a real pain to have to pay that every single time I go into London. So that kind of ruled a lot of the previous shape EVOs out for me. I'm personally a huge fan of the shape of these cars. I actually think they've grown on me quite a lot from when they were first released. I was quite a big fan of the similar era Impreza at the time, the hatchback shape, but I've gone off that quite a lot and love this car. I think in particular this front end is really mean and angry, with the offset number plate as well. I think it looks great. I'd say the rear end is possibly a little more clumsy. It's quite sort of upright at the back here, very flat shaped. It still looks good, but I think that's where some of the previous edition EVOs look much nicer. Another reason for getting an EVO 10 was we're expecting our first child in May, which is obviously very exciting, but I needed something with ISOFIX and rear doors, which thankfully this has. There's a good amount of room in the back as well, plenty of leg room there for any people. And we have the ISOFIX rear seats here, which is obviously very useful for anchoring child seats. I think for me, a super important thing to have in a car is that it's generally fun to use. That's why I had the Civic Type R. You saw me obviously take that around Castle Combe and Alton Park as well. It was great fun to drive, and this is no different as well. As you may have seen in the previous video, I took this out on Donington, and it was an absolute laugh. Very fun to drive. So we're gonna have a quick look at the interior now. It's got a really nice shaped steering wheel, and obviously that all-important manual gearbox. All of the FQ360 models have this manual gearbox. I don't think the SST could take the torque of the 360 and above. And as you can maybe see there, it's actually a 5-speed gearbox, which is quite rare for a 2011 sports car. But quite famously, all the EVOs struggled with their 6-speed gearboxes, none of them being quite as strong as the 5-speed, in which the Impreza weirdly had the opposite problem. It does have a satellite navigation system, which is obviously quite nice. It's a little bit dated, obviously, but it does show traffic and seems to be fairly accurate. I do tend to just use my phone on this magnetic mount instead. And then we've also got air conditioning, which may seem fairly standard to most people, but the Civic didn't have it and the Supra's doesn't work, so it is quite wonderful having cold air and being able to clear your windscreen. As you can see on here, it's now done 87,500 miles. I bought it on around 82,000, so it's done a good 5,000 miles with me in the past sort of 3 months, I think. You can see on here my trip computer, I've done 5,049 miles since I got the car. So quite a good amount of miles done already. I have to say one of my favourite things about the car are these seats. They're absolutely lovely to sit on. They do really well on a long journey, and they're pretty figure hugging as well for track use. And not to mention they look great with this little bit of sort of carbon fibre on here. There are a couple of other bits on the car that are carbon fibre, like this handbrake lever here. This front splitter is carbon fibre, and the rear sort of fins on the roof as well are carbon fibre as standard with the FQ360 model. This brings me quite nicely actually onto the sort of modifications that were already on the car when I got it. Unfortunately, the roof, as you can see here, has like a carbon fibre wrap on it, which I'm not a huge fan of. It looks a little cheap, and I think breaks up the nice sort of lines on the car, although actually I think the roof is meant to be black anyway as standard. I'm not 100% sure. The rear spoiler's got this same sort of wrap on it as well, and it's peeling off in a few places here, so I want to get that taken off properly. I think this should just help it to just look that little bit cleaner. The rear lights as well aren't standard, as well as the front lights. I can show you now. I think they are a brand called VLand or something. They're kind of sort of HID lights rather than the standard halogens I think that are included on this car. So I'm not the biggest fan of them, but I've priced up some standard lights and they're about 800 quid for a single front light. So I'm going to stick with them for now. The bonnet scoop as well has got this similar carbon fibre wrap, so I'm going to get that taken off as well. I'm a little bit nervous to do it myself just in case the paint comes off with it. And it looks a little bit sort of cracked here as well, so I'll probably get a professional to do that. It looks like the brakes have been sprayed purple, which I'm not a huge fan of as well. I think it looks a little bit ugly, especially as it's flaking off. It could very well be standard. I would prefer them to be red though, like the exterior colour of the car. The brakes are looking a little bit rusty. It's only because it's not moved for a little while. I've just come back from holiday. And then the other modifications on the car are underneath the bonnet. Annoyingly, they've sort of removed the engine cover from here, which is a black plastic engine cover. I'm going to get another one to put in its place. The pipes here are obviously all been sprayed, and as well as the rocker cover in this kind of pearlescent purpley blue tint, which again looks quite sort of chavvy. I'm not a huge fan of, but as with the headlights, it's more trouble than it's worth to get those changed, so I'm not going to bother with that. I had a few problems down here with the boost pipe popping off here. What we managed to do in the end was just pull this side further away from the turbo itself and put this side more onto the pipe, so sort of shimmied this whole rubber section up effectively. That seems to have held true, and then the car wasn't having any more issues at Donington and hasn't had any more issues since. It obviously has an intake and it has an exhaust as well, aftermarket exhaust, which I can show you around here. Obviously the pipes are a fair bit bigger than standard, but it's not obnoxiously loud, so I'm going to keep those as they are for now. The tyres as well. So I've put new tyres on here. We have Continental Sport Contact 7s, and they handle the track really well. The other thing that isn't standard on this car, which I can't really show you too well, but what I can show you is here, these are adjustment knobs for adjustable coilovers, KW coilovers. I can't really get underneath the car to show you exactly what they look like, but I think the suspension is a little bit too firm, so I'm going to have a play around with those adjusters and see if I can sort of slacken it off a little bit. Felt good around the track, but on road driving it is a little bit firm. I tend to actually only really notice it when a passenger's in the car complaining about it. I just kind of live with it because most of my cars are quite firmly sprung anyway, and have been always fairly firmly sprung, so I don't bother too much about it. But I think if I'm ever going to have more passengers in, which I'm going to have a child in there at some point, I probably need to slacken them off. So apart from the tyres, the only thing I have changed on this car is this front right wheel bearing. There's a little bit of a story behind that. Basically, I noticed just after I first got it, at around 25 mile an hour, there tend to be like this vibration, wheel bearing-y sort of noise, definitely coming from the front right. I took it into a garage, bought a wheel bearing for it, took it into the garage, and they called me and said, I think it's the front left. I was like, I'm pretty sure it's the front right. So yeah, I wasn't 100% sure whether I was definitely right or not, but I was pretty certain. So he was like, right, well, I'll just change the front right anyway, and see if that is the issue. And if it's not the issue, then, you know, we'll have a look at maybe doing the front left. So they set about changing that, and then realized that the front had spacers on it. It's got spacers all round, which I didn't realize at the time. So when they tried to fit the front hub sort of wheel bearing that I bought, obviously the studs weren't long enough, so they take the studs out of the old wheel bearing, and after all that, it turned out that the noise was in fact coming from the tyres the whole time. So I've got a new front wheel bearing, and I didn't need a new front wheel bearing or hub, but that was the reason for getting 4 new tyres, aside from the fact that it actually had 3 different brands of tyres across the 4. So yeah, not ideal on a 4-wheel drive car. So I thought I'd do a little sort of pros and cons list for this car. It's not for everyone. I will sort of preface this whole sort of section with that. If you're not a sort of car enthusiast, I just wouldn't recommend going for one of these for various reasons. But the pros are just the fact that it's cool. Like, it's an awesome car. People sort of take notice of it. People love the car. Whenever you see other sort of enthusiasts driving, they'll give you a thumbs up. In the petrol stations, I've had all sorts of comments on it, which is cool. I've spent a lot of time at the petrol stations. That will probably be in the cons list, but it's good to have a sort of daily driver that sort of garners that interest. I think as well, if you sort of compare it to the Impreza of the period, I just think it's much more interesting and rarer in general. I think that sort of goes across the board with EVOs in general. Imprezas were sold in the UK, I think, a lot more readily than the Mitsubishi EVOs were, and I just think there's something a bit more of a mystique about them because of that, and that's even the case with the 10s. I think that is something in particular that I really like about this 360 model as well, is that when I was looking for at the lower end of the market, there was probably, let's say, 50 SST models out there, whereas there was only 4 FQ360s. So it's quite cool to have something that's a little bit more niche and a little bit more advanced than the standard model. Not that it's really matters that much, but it is really fast. Even compared to the Supra, I mean, the Supra is about 280 horsepower. We reckon this is probably around 380 horsepower, and it feels sort of every horsepower of that. When it sort of comes on to boost, it throws you back in your seat. It's a lot of fun. It runs out of legs fairly quickly at the top end, but I think, yeah, that sort of acceleration is pretty brutal in this car, and it's a lot of fun because of that. A big pro, as I mentioned before, is these sort of comfy seats. I'm in here now just doing this little piece of the camera, and it's a really comfortable place to be, and they look really nice as well. You'd probably struggle, I think, if you were sort of on the larger side, I'd say, larger frame, because it is quite sort of figure hugging. Maybe a couple more years and that'll be an issue for me. But yeah, for now, I think these seats are some of the most comfortable I've ever sat in. I think in general, the interior is nicer than I expected. Again, I'm used to sort of Japanese cars being, the interiors just aren't their strong point, and it is a nice place to be in here. It's not anywhere near the sort of equivalent of an Audi or, you know, a Mercedes or whatever of this era. But I think it's very nice for a Japanese car, and for me it's a lot more advanced than the Civic was, and obviously a lot more advanced than the Supra. It's a bit of a shame it doesn't have CarPlay, but I guess that can kind of bring me on to the cons of this car. I think sort of the biggest con of this car, and this is what put a lot of people off in period and puts a lot of people off now, is just the fuel consumption. It uses a lot of fuel. There's no two ways about it. I mean, I tend to get a good miles per gallon on the motorway. I can get around 29 miles per gallon, which is actually surprisingly good. for this car. But the problem with it is that the fuel tank is so small. It's only a 55-litre tank, which is only slightly bigger than the Civic, but it does a lot worse miles per gallon than the Civic. So the real world range is actually only around 250 miles on a full tank, which just isn't enough really. It seems like it's needlessly small, the fuel tank. It hasn't caused too much issues for me. I've been okay with it for day-to-day driving, but I think on a longer journey, if you're going especially to Europe, it might just get a little bit painful. Not to mention the fact that it needs to be 98 or above octane, so finding something that is sort of 99 octane around the UK is actually more difficult than you think. You need to kind of go to Shell, or some Esso places have it. Some BP garages do, others don't. I think, yeah, there's sort of hit and miss whether some garages do it. Some don't even do super unleaded at all, like Morrison's, for example, which is annoyingly my local fuel filling station. So that does mean you need to sort of plan your trips a little bit further ahead than you would in most other cars. Again, it's not something that's a big deal, but it's probably the biggest con of this car, I'd say. I should mention actually on the fuel consumption part, the miles per gallon that I got at Donington was 7. Which is just obviously not good at all. The Supra got 8.4, I think it was. Yeah, this got even worse. Because it's only doing 7 miles per gallon, the range trip computer panics and thinks, oh, you've got no fuel left when you're at like 2/3, maybe half a tank. And I think this causes an issue with the fueling itself, and it thinks it's running out of fuel, so it gives you a fuel cut, which is what I think I was having the issue with on the main straights at Donington, where I kept getting fuel cuts under around half a tank. So that was something that I'm going to have a little look out for, and maybe a bit of a research into, and see if that was the issue or if there's something more untoward there. But that's what I think it probably was. Something that I wasn't quite expecting, because the Japanese are normally quite good for it from my experience, especially the Civic was good and the Supra is really good as well. The gearbox just feels a little bit kind of agricultural, is the only way I can describe it. It's just a little bit kind of notchy and not always smooth going into gear. Whether that's an issue with this particular gearbox and it's been used and abused, I don't know. I'd be interested to try it in comparison to another EVO. But yeah, I mean, I think especially when it's cold, going from first into second, sometimes you just have to move it into neutral, take your foot off the clutch, put your foot on the clutch again, and then get it into second. It just doesn't always like it. It seems to snicken up and feel a lot nicer when you're using it heavily, like at Donington. It seemed to be much better once the sort of gearbox is nice and warm. But yeah, that is something that I wasn't quite expecting. But as I said, I'm not 100% sure if that's a problem with this gearbox in particular, or if that's just a problem with these 5-speeds in general, because I guess they're sort of built to take more torque than those 6-speeds, so maybe that's something to do with the sort of way they're designed. These cars are quite famous for sort of AYC control issues. I think that means active yaw control, I'm not 100% sure. It's to do with the 4-wheel drive system. They sort of put the pump for this AYC system underneath the car, where obviously it gets a lot of abuse from the road and from salt and all sorts, and it tends to go wrong. A lot of people will relocate the AYC pump into the boot. I actually kind of need the boot space, so I haven't done that myself. But maybe that's something I'll have to get checked in a service and make sure everything's running as it is normally, because they can be quite expensive to rebuild. So again, something to keep an eye on. So a little issue on this car, is whenever you start it, it has an AFS warning light and it's sort of flashing constantly on the dashboard, which is really annoying. That's to do with the aftermarket headlights. It has like an automatic fog light system, I think that's what it stands for. So when you turn the wheel, obviously one of the fog lights comes on, and turn it the other way, the other fog light comes on. That's been disabled because of these aftermarket headlights. So I need to get like a resistor or something put in there to stop this flashing light. A little bit annoying, because it's constantly flashing when you're driving. It seems really unnecessary for it to be doing that. Again, that is something I will get sorted. I think I just need to get a resistor put in there, but I'll have a auto electrician have a look at that and see if there's any other way of doing it. And then one more little issue it has is there's a little rattle somewhere in this door card, which seems to happen sometimes when you're driving. It's a nice looking door card with this kind of shiny sort of piano black trim and the suede material here. But yeah, there's a little rattle somewhere, so I need to sort of take the door card off and diagnose that. But that's about it really for the video on the car. In terms of what's next, I just kind of want to get some of the modifications removed and it toned down a little bit more. I'm not that interested in getting any more power out of it or anything like that. It's quick enough as it is. But I'd just like to get some of the sort of more chavvy looking modifications toned down a little bit. But keep an eye out for more videos on this car and also for more on the Supra. But for now, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe if you want to subscribe. If you don't, then don't bother, and I'll see you in the next one.